So, Ian, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
All right. Well, I grew up in the country in New South Wales, and when I was about 6, I think, my dad and mum, who were both from had been living in Sydney, they moved out to a small property. My dad had this idea of being like a hobby farmer. He wanted to grow jojoba, and he was a very eccentric fellow. He was a 10-pound pom, which means that he and his family came out on a boat after the war, World War II, from England. And at that time, they kind of had a subsidized immigration program for the Brits. For 10 pounds, they could come out on a boat and get a new life in Australia. That's why they're called 10-pound poms.
Huh.
So, yeah. So he was one of those guys. He was like a small child during the war. And his family are from Kent, which I don't know if you know much about the English geography, but basically it's on the east coast. You know, the White Cliffs of Dover are in that county. Yeah. So when he was a baby when the war started and the Germans were bombing the hell out of that area, and he got like meningitis as a result of the shock of the bombs, apparently.
My.
And he was a guinea pig for some kind of immunization for it, and they didn't know if it'd kill him or not, but they basically said to his mum, look, we we give it to him, he might survive, but he's probably going to die anyway, so do you mind if we try this vaccine out on him? Saved him, but caused him to have some short-sightedness, I think, or long-sightedness, either way. Anyway, so he was one of those kids like the C.S. Lewis kids in Narnia. They were evacuated from where the bombs were hitting over to Wales. And so he was somehow fostered out to a Sudeten Czech German family. I don't know how that worked, but yeah. And they told him, your parents don't love you, you're ours now, and we're going to raise you to be a good German boy. And he was separated from his parents from that very early age. And he remembered seeing his mum at some dance or something and saying, who's that lady? Oh, that's your mum, that kind of thing, you know. My grandmother was busy with, she was doing things like driving army trucks around and stuff and teaching. She was involved in getting Jewish people out of like East Europe and teaching them English over there. Like, so yeah, and his father was working on planes in the factories, you know. So at the end of the war, sort of, 1945, I guess, his father came over to where my dad was, which is a town called, he used to say Llangollen in Wales. And anyone Welsh would probably go, that's not right. But, anyway, he sees this guy show up and he doesn't know who he is. Like, he's a total stranger to him, So he was profoundly damaged from all that, obviously, and it was never addressed, partly because that's the generational thing, partly because they were just so British as well, and you don't talk about uncomfortable things like that. So, but one of the things that had also damaged him was, I think my grandmother had overcompensated for her absence by showering my dad with praise for everything. So he didn't think he could do anything wrong. And he was quite narcissistic. And my sister and I, she's 4 years younger than me, we didn't realize how kind of mad he was until much later. Because, when you...
Of course, they're your parent.
They're your parents. You just think that's what they are, that's normal. We knew my mum was kind of mad, but yeah. So we lived in, like, Dad had this plan of being totally energy self-sufficient and living in a rammed earth house with this jojoba farm and all of this stuff. And he was teaching at the local TAFE, which is a kind of college. But that plan never worked, and there was like a kit home was set up there on the property for us to stay in while the real house got built, and that never happened. And the house that we had was a bit of a shoebox, and it was really basic. It had like a steel frame. The cladding was like 1/4-inch fiberboard slab on the outside, a couple of sheets of styrofoam in the middle, and then another 1/4-inch slab on the inside. So no insulation. And we were off the grid because he refused to get connected. He was going to do it his way. So he bought solar panels, and this is back in the 80s. And it sounds like he's a hippie, but he wasn't. He was actually quite conservative, but he had these weird hippie-ish sort of instincts about self-sufficiency. And so our power situation was bad. When we were kids, we didn't have enough power to like run lights properly in the house. You'd have to be, it made us very energy conscious, I guess, because you couldn't leave a room and leave the light on. You'd have to, because it'd just drain the batteries, and then the lights would start flickering, and then they'd be gone. Then there's bring out the lanterns, bring out the kerosene lamps and the candles.
Yeah.
Luckily we had a lot of books. That was good. My dad had books everywhere. The power situation was not good. And in the winter, it'd be very cold in my room. I'd see my breath, there'd be condensation running down the inside of the window. In the summertime, it'd get hot enough, the candles would just fall over on the tables. That's it. That's in the house. They're just lying on the table, that kind of thing. Yeah. So that was power situation and insulation, everything else. But the worst thing was like the toilet situation was the worst, because he didn't want to have a septic tank installed. So he had this thing that they call an eco loo, and if you've never heard of it, you're lucky.
It doesn't sound good.
Yeah, it's not good. It's meant to be plugged into a power source so that it can heat and decompose the feces that build up in it, but we didn't have power for that. So basically, it's like, yeah. Because some people thought that I had a long drop there, which is when they have a big just pit in the ground, and I was like, yeah, that would have been better, because this one you have to empty out, and that's not nice. And so anyway, poor old Dad. He was a very loving man and very big-hearted, but he was totally mad. When we look back on it, he thought that was fine. He couldn't work out why we were embarrassed to get friends over, or so yeah, that was him. So like I'd been living in China for a couple of years and came back start of 2016, and when I got back,
how'd you get to China?
Dad. I went over there to teach English because I've lived in China a few different times.
Okay.
Teaching English over the years, and I keep going back to visit when I can. Okay. I feel very close to the place and I love it, but this last time that I had there working there, I promised myself never to do that again. I was thinking, I don't ever want to come back and work here for a Chinese company because of the way they do things. I just don't like it. Huh. And if I'd love to go back there, but probably only to visit. And if I went back there in a work capacity, it would have to be like for a Western company. Because, yeah, just the way they do things is very different. Anyone who's lived there for a while would know. And I noticed that in one of your videos you brought up that AD connection.
It just glitched right when you're there. So anyone who's lived in China would know. And right.
One of your videos you had these guys that ride around on scooters in China and do their videos and put them on YouTube. I think it's ADV China or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got the South African guy and the American guy. Anyway, a lot of the stuff they talk about, I'm like, oh yeah, mm-hmm. And and you were talking about the moral system, because that guy was talking about how, you know, he'd seen that girl getting robbed, and he was, yeah, right. And I found that totally unsurprising. One thing I admired about the Chinese and their values is their the way they look after their family. They take that really seriously, and they do it better than us, I think. And that's part of that Confucianist filial piety thing, right? But on the other hand, if you're not kin, they'll walk over you in the street, you know. Like it's really, that's the limit of it. It's understandable in a culture and a place that has always been massively populated, I guess. You've got it, you can't save everyone. But, you know, I remember things like when I first went there and I'd see these beggars, and particularly back when I first went to Shanghai in 2005, it was far less developed then, although it was already going. Great guns. But if you're with someone and if you gave them money, they'd sort of chastise you for it. And the usual response from them was, why are you giving them money? They're all rich. You know, they saw them all as scams, right? Now, there are a lot of scam artist beggars in China, lots. But they just had this black and white. They're rich, they'd say. Not just they don't need it, they're rich. I thought, that's funny. It could have been the limited English. They couldn't put the nuance in it. But yeah, they thought it was odd that I would do that. And there's also just their ability to walk past people in that state and just be so oblivious to it. I was struck by. Yeah, it's very cynical, right? And there's no faith in the system in that sense either. Like, they don't seem to have any welfare, really. For a so-called socialist country, it's really every man for himself, it seems. Now, if you're a Westerner there, a lot of people say, you know, contracts don't mean anything there. And yeah, it's kind of the case. They will often have two contracts for people going there to work. Like if you want to teach there or something, they'll have the English language one that you sign, but they'll have their own Chinese language one. And they always default to that, right? And yeah, and all the power's with them. And in my experience, and this is really summarizing because it's fantastically complicated, that place, but they kind of either micromanage the hell out of you, every little, you know, they scrutinize and criticize every little thing you do, or they're totally hands off, but you got no support and no idea what you're doing, and they don't care, they're disengaged. It seems to be quite a bit of either one or the other. And yeah, very, very sort of punitive with the way they run their businesses, you know, top down, very hierarchical, very much boss says this, do it now, you know. And yeah, they work crazy hours to get ahead, because if they don't, then they might lose their job, and how do they look after their family and all of this stuff. So yeah, but yeah, I mean, I don't mean to make it sound awful, but these were my impressions.
If it was so awful, you wouldn't have kept going back. I mean,
right?
It's always good and bad.
Yeah, there's something about the place that's always been attractive to me ever since I was a kid. The stories of Marco Polo and that, I like the ideas of that. But yeah, I also went and lived in Taiwan for half a year, and before going there, I'd read all these articles about it's the vibrant, capitalist, liberal China, you know, coming from the American press. And I got there and I realized after a while that most of the differences with the mainland were fairly superficial. And although they have a democratic system where they vote, it doesn't feel like it almost. It's still very much, I realize that they're just very conservative, socially, and it's something deeper than communism. It made me realize this runs deeper than communism. This is something deeper than that. And I think it's more to do with Confucianism, because that tends to be about, social harmony and hierarchy. And in a fundamental sense, they seem more concerned with social harmony, and you always hear them use that word, than individual liberty. And they've never developed that concept in the way that the West has. And it reflects in their moral and other behaviors and attitudes. You see, you know what I mean? So I found that kind of interesting. But
have you seen how Christianity is impacting that culture? Have you had any chance to observe that?
Yeah. It was more obvious in Taiwan because they are free to do it there, and they're not going to get closed tomorrow on the whim of the government. I didn't go to church there, but I remember this Irish friend that I had at the time. He was like, "I'm going to mass," and I was like, "Oh, right, here." And he's like, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh, yeah, that'd be interesting. It's done in Chinese, is it?" "Yeah, okay." And you'd see, this was weird, big crucifixes marking the churches, but around the edge of them, they'd be illuminated with red neon. And I found that really visually weird. It just seemed really kind of almost a satanic thing, and I was like, why the red? What's with the red neon around the cross? Odd. But it seemed to have its place in Taipei. There were also, you'd see people in different kind of monk outfits, reflecting different schools of Buddhism. There'd be some that with a saffron, then there'd be grey ones, black ones, this and that. Quite a few vegetarian places, I think, catering to that. So religion seemed to be, safe there. Whereas in China, it's not really talked about much in my experience, although the last place I was living, which is in the far, far north, up near Russia, it's north of North Korea. And one of my students in one of the classes actually said to me he was Christian. And I was like, that's interesting, because I did feel that his behavior was a little different than the others. And it's hard to put my finger on, but it just seemed to be a little bit more authentically nice, because there's a lot of fake nice. And he did have a different feel to him, and I wondered about that. And you read these things about how Christianity is really growing in China. It's becoming quite popular, but at the same time, the government's getting scared and starting to close churches and clamp down. And I mean, hopefully it won't go the way of Falun Gong, because that was they really crushed that when it became suddenly too big for them. And the Chinese leadership is deadly afraid of rebellion from within, which is why apparently they spend more on their domestic surveillance than they do on their externally oriented military. And you've got the social credit system there, which is straight out of Orwell. It not even is like Orwell. It really is,
Really?
Yeah. I don't know if you've seen much about that, but
I've heard a little bit about it, but it hasn't.
Well, yeah, basically you get points for sucking up and you get points for defying the government. It's not as simple as that. They had an example of this busy intersection. I think it was in Chongqing. It was one of the cities out in the west. And they had a problem with jaywalkers. So they started shaming them by blowing up their face on a billboard at the square there and with their details. And at first, apparently, people were like, oh, cool, I'm up on that. And then they realized, oh, I'm being shamed, for jaywalking, that kind of mass shaming. And it's weird. I see echoes of it in the shaming culture that's going on in the West at the moment, but it's nowhere near as prevalent. Well, it sort of seems to affect celebrity types more, but
well, that's because their entire their identity is built on that mechanism. So if you can reverse the mechanism, you can turn them from a star to a black hole.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, well put. Yeah, definitely. But yeah, there was a few other things I was wanting to ask or talk about. But oh, by the way, I thought it was cool. The other day I was listening to one of your talks, and you said, "Don't play chicken with God," and I was like, wrote that down. I thought that's a good quote. Yeah, but like Tolkien and stuff too, mythology, things like that you've mentioned a few times. That's close to my heart. I mean, my dad was a big Tolkien fan too, but I like The Lord of the Rings was the first book I read as a kid that I thought, this is my favorite book, and I devoured it. And I remember being on school holidays at my grandparents in Sydney, and my grandmother was like, why don't you go out and play a bit? And I was like, I was just so absorbed in the book, I couldn't put it down, you know. And then a few years later I read Silmarillion, and I was like, oh wow, this is like biblical sort of type stuff, you know, clearly borrowing a lot there. But that kind of thing was a big influence on me. And of course, you know, reading C.S. Lewis as a kid. But I've come back to sort of listening to stuff about him more recently, mainly because you've brought up things of his that I was unaware of. You know, I didn't realize what a great mind he had for that stuff, you know. It's interesting. And the more you listen to stuff, the more you realize how much is out there that you don't know yet. And yeah, it just doesn't end.
It doesn't end.
Yeah, I guess that was one of the things about China too. It was like this never-ending puzzle that you go, oh, I've got this bit. Oh, wait a minute, what's that over there? I don't know that. You know. Yeah.
And a place as old and big and deep as China. You know, just wow.
I think you could live there forever and still find stuff that surprises you. Yeah. But I know a lot of my friends who've been there for like years, 10 years or more. Quite a few are starting to say, you know, I'm getting out because of the feeling that the government is clamping down ever tighter. And there's a bit more jingoism in the air and a bit more anti-foreign sentiment. And it's getting harder for people to renew their visas and all of this stuff. And on the other side, it's no longer the Wild West frontier that attracted a lot of us, that sense of it's a bit loose, it's a bit out there, it's a bit frenetic. But, you know, if you go to Shanghai now, it's incredible how much it's changed in the last 10 years. And there's just foreigners everywhere, like white people everywhere. And like, you know, it's been colonized almost by hipsters. And but it sort of feels like it's lost a bit of that adventurous unknown thing in a way, but it's also becoming more restrictive. And yeah, quite a few people I think are sort of thinking it's maybe time to go.
Interesting.
Yeah. But what was I going to ask about? I had that list of things and I was like, there's too many things to talk about. So I was thinking about music and meaning as well. Because like, do you play music?
I started playing the violin in first grade with the Suzuki method.
Oh, really?
And so I played the violin all the time until about 10th grade or 11th grade. And then in college, basically, I abandoned it because there were so many other interesting things to do. And I picked it up. I picked it up for a few months here at church when we had no other musicians or few other musicians.
Nice.
So I played here, but I haven't given myself to the violin for a long, long time.
So you miss it?
No, not really. I would love to. Part of the problem is that I have the same violin that I had from junior high and high school. And so my parents didn't have much money, so it's not a very good violin. So if I really wanted to get into it, I'd need to invest in a better instrument. And at this point, I just really haven't seen fit to put a few $1,000s into a violin, especially since the YouTube thing has started. So that that has taken a lot of
Right.
hobby time. And
I can imagine.
so
I'm amazed that you're.
It's all priorities and hierarchies, so it just hasn't hit the top.
Yeah. Right. I'm amazed that you're able to do all this as it is and make time for people like this. It's pretty amazing, yeah.
Well, I think
that really speaks to your it speaks to your character as a pastor, I think,
Well,
so
I think
your church is fortunate to have you.
Well, I think to me, these conversations are just so fascinating because y'all find me, and everybody's got a story, and even the story about your dad and your mom and growing up, how you did in China. I mean, I'm very high in openness, obviously, but to me, it's just all wow. It's just so cool, and so then I get to interact with it. It's like YouTube plus interaction. It's even better.
Yeah.
So I love it.
I can see how that would be attractive. And it also, you just made me think of something Peterson had said, which is like, everyone's got their story. And if you just listen, you'll find that after a little while, people start telling you some crazy stuff, and I was like, yeah, that's pretty true. Like, yeah.
It's very true. And what's been fun, and I stumbled into this, because I was having these conversations just privately.
Right.
It was like I was having these conversations, and it's like these should be shared. More people, because then when you add different points to it, now suddenly other people can connect. And this is essentially what pastors do. Someone comes to my church, they listen to me preach, they get a little interested. Oh, they talk to me, but I'm not a successful pastor until the people are interested in each other and it doesn't all go through me.
Right. That's a really good way of looking at it. Yeah.
So that's why this is fun, because then when I can post it on the channel, others in the comment section, then you get some conversation going back and forth. Well, now there's really potential for interesting connections. And then when it jumps the gap from the cyberspace into real life, which is what happens at the meetups, that's even cooler because, for example, Job, who I've done some conversations with, he was in Southern California for a conference. I was going down to Southern California for work. My friend John Vandonk was down there. So we got to spend some time together. And so that's part of why the Australia trip is going to be fascinating, because I know nothing about Australia, but then to go there and to meet people, and when you meet a person in real life, it's different again. And it's really fun.
That just made me think of that T.S. Eliot line, and I don't know which poem it was, but he's got a line that says something like, preparing the faces to meet the faces that you meet. And it's like it doesn't have to be deception. It's more like the fact that you adjust and present different aspects, and you can't really help that. It's also about how you're interpreted, obviously. But absolutely, I mean, going from the virtual to the real is so important. And I think, in this postmodern existence that we have, where we seem to be quite atomized and increasingly online, it's like, man, we really are all on some level missing church in that sense of like a sense of community around shared values. And I've just moved back to Melbourne a couple of weeks ago, after I'd been in my hometown, so to speak, looking after my mum, because after my dad died, she didn't take it too well. They hadn't been together since I was about 13, but they still cared for each other, and obviously he lived out at his shack and she lived in the actual proper town, like with a house.
So he stayed in the shack his whole life.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
When he was dying of bowel cancer, I made him go with me over to my sister's house in Adelaide in South Australia, because that was like after my last trip to China, living in China. I got back to the country. I was planning to go overseas again. And then Dad said, I've got terminal cancer. I was like, right, okay. I registered to become his carer. And I was with him at his place for a while, and it was doing my head in just living in that house. I said to him, I was like, well, look, I was planning with my sister the whole time. She's, because I had nowhere to take him to because I'd been out of the country. And it's like, what do I do? My sister was like, bring him to our place in Adelaide. We got room. You can all stay there together and look after him. But he just didn't want to do that. He didn't want to leave home. He wanted me to stay with him there. I said, I can't do this. I won't do it. I'm sorry. But I just am almost suicidal being in this house with you, a dying man in this house, no power and no toilet and all this stuff. It just was too much. So in the end, we sort of wrangled him over there, and on the condition that he goes for like 6 months or whatever. And it's like anything to get him over there. It's like, right, okay. Plus, their oncology systems were a lot better, and I'd have my sister around to help with the, But not long after we arrived in Adelaide, he started kind of just not playing ball. And it was like he saw it as a zero-sum game, that he couldn't find a happy compromise with us about his care. It was his way or he just wasn't interested. And so he increasingly just sort of was like wanting to go home. And I kept saying to him, look, give it a go. And then he started deteriorating. He had a stroke one morning. I heard him call out. I got up and he's on the toilet, like side on with, he was like, I think I'm having a stroke and convulsing. And I was like, okay, call the ambulance, get him. He died basically. And, they, like pretty much they were like, it's the brain doctor when I got there. And my sister was away too for a wedding. And she had to rush back because the doctor said to me, look, he's going to die. He's had a massive hematoma in the brain. We need your permission to put him on a respirator to keep him going until your sister gets here. If that's what you want, we need your permission because he has to not resuscitate. So I said, yeah, because I had power of attorney and stuff. I said, yeah, can you keep him alive till my sister gets back, So she got back and we're all sort of quite tearful and saying our goodbyes, and they took him off the respirator, and then he's just come to and started talking, and the brain doctor was looking at him and he was literally gobsmacked. It was like, right, okay. So as long as he continues to defy me, so he dodged a bullet there, and then he was starting to push to go home. And the thing was, he could never really be honest about those things, emotions and stuff, because he just wouldn't admit that, okay, he wanted to go home to die. And I realized that was what it was, but it wouldn't come out of him. It was just like, he kept saying, I'll go back. It's healing land there. He kept talking about these ley lines running through the land that he believed were there. He really believed that there was some kind of magic healing power to that land. And then we were like, well, if it had that, why did you develop third stage liver cancer while living there? It just doesn't make sense, Yeah. But he had those ideas. And then he had a bowel obstruction, and I had to take him to the hospital again, emergency. And then he kept pushing to go home. And I said, okay, look, I'll take you home if that's what you really want, but I can't live there with you. I can't stay there with you. I can't do it. Yeah. And he was saying, he had this idea, oh, well, maybe I could get a young married couple who are looking for a place to stay at my place rent-free and look after me. And I'm like, oh, you'd have to pay them to live in that house, A, and B, on top of that, they've got to look after you. I don't think so. He didn't realize how crazy that sounded, And and then so when he did die, I just come back to Melbourne and had a couple of job interviews, and it was looking good. I had a couple of jobs lined up that I was ready to go to, and the day I was due to start, I get a call that he's passed in the hospital at Wagga. So I had to ditch that, go back to Wagga again, which is the hometown, Wagga, place of many crows, apparently. That's what it is in the local Aboriginal language, apparently, so we're told. So I had to deal with that. And And then my mother was starting to get a bit unhinged, and then she just had a full breakdown, and she's done that before. She's had nervous breakdowns in the past. And when she left, when we were kids, I was about 13, I think, 12, 13. She'd had enough of the conditions at that place that we were living in, and she was going back to Sydney to get a job to send money down so that maybe we could have, you know, 20th century conditions a bit more in the house, because she didn't want us to be in high school and studying by kerosene lanterns and stuff. So she went up to Sydney and she got a job there and was living at her father's house. And he died not long after that, and that messed her up. And then my dad saw her and left her a note apparently saying, you know, I don't want you as my wife anymore, and just went back to his place. He'd seen her leaving as a betrayal of his vision rather than understanding it as she's doing what she can to help us. And mum being mum, she's too agreeable, and she didn't want to fight him in court. Of course she would have won. She didn't want to drag the kids through that. So she kind of he just got his way, and that's how he was. He was very, very controlling. But then she would call, obviously going through a breakdown. And, you know, I'm a 13-year-old kid. She's calling me on the phone for like hours at a time, crying and saying stuff like, if it wasn't for you kids, I would have killed myself, you know. And I was like, I don't know what to say that, you know, like, so yeah, she had a breakdown after Dad died, and she had to go into a mental health unit for about 6 weeks while I cleaned up her house, cleaned up Dad's house out of town. And she's a bit of a hoarder, so there was a lot to do there, like massive amount to do there. I got her set up with My Aged Care, which is a program where they send people around to help with shopping, etc. All these things. I've got occupational therapists who've come around and met us, and they're going to install things in the house for her. And so she's okay now. That's why I've come back to Melbourne. And I just got here, and I'm going to hopefully get a job soon. And my main reason for coming back to Melbourne is to work on music with my good friend who I've done music with for some time now. And we've been working on stuff and putting songs up on SoundCloud and Bandcamp. And the last time we put some songs up in 2017, end of the year, it was like finishing that and working on it gave me such a sense of meaning that was really strengthening. And it was like one of the few times in the last few years where I'd done something purely for myself and my own enjoyment, not out of duty. Mm-hmm. So it was really attractive to come back to do more of that and let work sort itself around that. But that's when I started also around that time listening to Peterson's videos, and especially the biblical series. That really got me going. And I think there's a lot of us out there that are like hoping that he'll get back around to that at some point. I know he's a busy guy and stuff's I tend to think like you that he's an authentic person, and he's, you know, I don't see why people are wanting to rip down people all the time like that. It's like, man, he's doing a lot of good and making people think about serious stuff. Yeah. And I think, you know, I've listened to your videos where you're talking about meaning as sacrament and all that, and it totally makes sense. And especially when my dad died, my mum was in the mental ward, and I'm like driving around the country listening to these podcasts and thinking, you know, this is nourishing. You know, I'm attracted to that stuff, and it makes me think also of something that Nietzsche said, which was like that some people are elevated by the heavier thoughts, you know, in a paradoxical way. Something along those lines. I can't remember the exact quote. But in the past, when I've been going through rough patches or breakups and stuff, I often found I'd read Nietzsche, and it somehow made me feel better, even though people think Nietzsche is so dark. And I'm like, yeah, but it kind of puts things into perspective, doesn't it? You know, like the genealogy of morals and the Antichrist and stuff like that, I found really interesting. But you know, I guess philosophy is something that I really love, all that stuff. But you know, it's interesting. I've thought about how Nietzsche's concept of the will, which is derived from Schopenhauer's concept, obviously, and kind of a modification of that in reaction to. But it's like, are we talking about I love what you've got there with the God 1 and God 2, and it seems to me that they're both grappling with God number 1, with the concept of the will. But it's interesting that Schopenhauer was ultimately pessimistic about it, and he saw the cosmic will as negative in the end. And of course, he was greatly interested in Hinduism and Buddhism and that sort of thing. Whereas Nietzsche was affirmative about it. And it's hard to say how much of that it is because Nietzsche was wanting to be his own man and stand up against, I think he said something like he was my one true educator about Schopenhauer, although he ripped into him. But it's a bit like Jung and Freud. And similar to Jung and Freud, Nietzsche was the guy who said something about, I think it was Nietzsche that said it's a poor student that doesn't surpass his master. I think it might have been that he said that. And Jung, according to the story I heard, Jung quoted that to Freud when they broke as well. So, yeah, I might be...
autobiography, that chapter on Freud was a fascinating chapter.
Yes, I heard you read out that excerpt where they were arguing about, and the bookcase, boom, Yeah. A friend of mine had told me that previously, and I thought, yeah, that's interesting. He seemed to be an incredibly powerful figure, and both of them in their own ways, but, I'd always found I intuitively found ideas from Jungian perspective more interesting than the Freudian thing. I don't know. How are we going for time? Okay, about 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Yeah.
I don't have anyone after you, so I've just got a ton of stuff to do before I get on an airplane. But
yeah. So there were a few things I thought that I might ask your opinions on, and one of them was like the idea of language, and people talk about memes and so on a lot, and I'm talking about the Dawkins idea, which Peterson often says, well, he kind of got that from Jung with the archetypes, but William Burroughs, I read this thing that he said one time about language as a virus, and I remember reading that, and it's like nothing was the same afterwards almost. It was like, language is a virus, and I thought about it, I was like, what if that's true? It kind of is in a way, and how does it work? How does it operate in that way of infecting people, and how does it shape our worldviews? Because obviously people with different languages, it's different, it really is. And then there's and that links in, I guess, with when, Peterson talks about the word as the manifestation of truth in being in the self. And of course, the biblical emphasis on the word, the word. I'm like, so what's going on here with this? What is it with words, and what's its power, and how do we derive such meaning from them? And also inspiration is another thing. I'm like, what's that about? Inspiration, where does that come from? And you don't control it, and you can't really plan for it, and there's something else going on there that we're not running the show with, right? And that's the kind of area, I guess, where a lot of people are starting to break with the rational atheists and going, no, that's not satisfying me, anymore. Yeah. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that idea or language and its importance with our perception.
Well, I mean, language as a virus. Someone sent me a link to a Canadian film yesterday that I just watched some of the trailer to it, and the thesis of the film was exactly that language was a virus, and somehow C.S. Lewis actually has this in The Magician's Nephew, in his Narnia novels, There's of course the deplorable word. And as a child reading that book, or a young person, I don't know when I read it for the first time. So then suddenly you're fascinated by, well, there's a deplorable word, and that word laid waste to worlds. And of course, Jadis, the woman who would become the queen of Narnia and Narnia's winter, I mean, she laid waste to worlds via the deplorable word. And,
interesting. Because I've forgotten that. I haven't read it since I was little, though. So yeah.
But that idea, I think is right. Satan, of course, is a liar. And okay, what do you mean by liars? And I was so fascinated when Peterson, in an early question and answer video, he's got this very interesting relationship with church. And he talks about, well, I just can't stand sitting through sermons because pastors are such liars. And that just fascinated me, because on one hand, I thought, well, that's really true. And well, I shouldn't say that because I'm a pastor. I'm a lying pastor too. And what Peterson means by lying, of course, via Solzhenitsyn, is this use of language. Really, it's sophistry. It's
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Socrates versus the sophists. It's sophistry. And
it's inauthentic.
Right. And of course, Augustine too. Augustine, when he was coming up in the late Roman period, the rhetoric was the king of. That's what you wanted all of your sons to know, rhetoric. And why? Because rhetoric is power. Words have power, and so you train your sons in rhetoric. And of course, Augustine, one of the most brilliant people in all of human history, learns rhetoric, but then becomes a Christian. And so, in a sense, this tool that was developed was then used, to shape the West in very deep ways. But at some point, words. And I think this is the idea of logos and the word of God. Words finally must bow their knee to their Lord. And this is why Satan is a liar, because he uses words as viruses, as slayers of worlds and killers of people. And I think all the way back to the first story you told me of your father, he's sent to this family in Wales, and what do they tell him? Your family has abandoned you because they don't love you. Talk about words.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so here, that's a virus, and it just goes into the mind of a child, and whoosh. And as a pastor, part of what's been so when you go through seminary as a pastor, one of the things they always tell you is, well, don't play the psychologist. Well, why do they tell you that? Because all the pastors are playing psychologists, and they keep telling pastors, you're not psychologists. But what seminary failed to lay out is, okay, so don't play a psychologist. Well, what do we do? And seminary was actually poor of saying, because I think of the deep materialism that even impacted a conservative denomination like the Christian Reformed Church, they didn't quite have the way of saying, well, because actually if the story verse is foundational and it's actually shaping and governing and colonizing the material verse, the matter verse, what pastors do, in fact, is deeply powerful by use of the word. And this got put into the word of God. So when pastors get up into the pulpit, and in my tradition, pastors speak the word of God. Now that then, okay, it's the Bible, and the Bible is the word of God, but how is the sermon the word of God? And again, this was never really explained or gone into in seminary. And I suspect because what happens sometimes in liturgy is that the words remain, but what was behind the words was lost. And so then you get into this formalism.
Right. Yeah.
And it wasn't really understood, and it wasn't conveyed to me, or perhaps I simply, as a young man, didn't have the capacity to recognize it, because I find that all the time in my life. You read something and it's like, it has no grip on me because I just don't understand it.
Yeah, and then later it's like, okay, yeah,
Right.
yeah,
So
yeah,
so I think I think that's very right in that the and of course famously the Gospel of John, the word becomes flesh. Well, in a sense that happens, and I don't say this to take anything away from the incarnation or the Gospel of John, but when, for example, in let's say Steve Jobs creating the iPod. Okay, so they're all storied about that. In a sense, Steve Jobs' word became matter. You have kind of this idea of the formal cause, Aristotle's formal cause, and if you can see that, you can begin to understand that's really how the world works. It isn't this inversion that happened with materialism or physicalism. That's not really how the world works. It's certainly not how people work. And so when that foster family told your father, in a sense, the deplorable word,
right,
that shaped his whole life.
absolutely, yeah, yeah,
And when you see that, you begin to understand, wow, word. Word, the Bible isn't kidding about this. We're
right.
just too dull to recognize it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Hmm. Um, yes, well, I've actually just started. I've actually just started reading recently the Bible. I found a copy when I was back in Wagga that was on the bookshelf. I thought, oh, I'll give this another go. And it's so strange now looking at Genesis, and then I'm already sort of influenced by hearing Peterson's talk on it. So I'm looking at this, and there'll be a little part that's like a few lines long, and it's like, but he talked about that for an hour, like there's so many layers that it's like, yeah, no, and there was never any sort of guidance with that sort of thing in any sort of way from anyone that I knew, religiously or otherwise, that had really kind of pushed into it like that. So I think that there's a whole lot of people that are missing out on something substantive there, and just they dismiss it as the word, but just the word. It's just words in a book. It's just a story. And it's like, yeah, it's easy to think that until you start to think more about it, right? For example, I'm also reading, and I've been slugging through this because I find it a difficult read, but I got a copy of the Quran that friends of mine got for me when they were in Egypt. And yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to get through that. I find it
Well,
I don't
did you
want to
learn
upset
Arabic so
people
that you
about
can
this.
actually read it?
No, I've got the English language one, so it doesn't matter
Oh, so
anyway
it's not the
because it's
real Quran.
not legit. It's not legit, is it? No, it's got to be Arabic. So, God speaks Arabic apparently, and that's number one. So, but uh, look, obviously, I don't have an Islamic scholar around the corner that would be willing to have an open discussion about this, because I remember thinking, why don't they do what Peterson's doing with the Quran to make sense of it for people, make it revivify it in a sense? But then I was like, yeah, they'd probably get a fatwa put on them if they tried that. But um,
and that
but
and that and that point itself. So if you look, so University of Toronto has on their website a whole bunch of lectures given by Northrop Frye on literature professor, and so there's Jung's behind Peterson, Piaget's behind Peterson, Nietzsche's behind Peterson. I mean, on and on and on and on.
right,
Northrop Frye Peterson is standing on Northrop Frye's shoulders. One of the points Northrop Frye makes in one of those early lectures at the University of Toronto is there's something foundational to the fact that Christianity is derived from the Old Testament in translation. And this is true all the way along in terms of the history of Christianity. And so when the Chinese get a hold of Christianity, Chinese Christianity will be different from the Christianity the missionaries were trying to give to them. And one of the most amazing facts of Christianity is that it seems to be able to hop cultures and not lose the thread.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at Judaism or Islam, you do Judaism, well, you've got to teach your children Hebrew because you have to read the text in the language. You go to Islam, you have to learn Arabic. You have to read the text in the language. The difficulty that you have
to recite in Arabic, yeah.
Right.
And then you've got the predicament where you've got, you know, all these Muslims in Indonesia, for example, that can recite the Quran but don't really understand what it's about or anything. It's just like, you know, they can recite the Arabic but they don't speak Arabic, and that's that sort of thing. I think that's so weird. What a disconnect, you know?
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. Yep. So Christianity seems to be able to go viral in translation. That's fascinating. And whereas, so there are often conflicts between Christians from different cultures, and there's but then what often happens is that Christianity then becomes and I think that's part of how it's able to go viral. Christianity then becomes, you have to filter out the cultural aspects as it's going cross-cultural. So whereas we can never, it's just like the dilemma. Someone once asked Peterson, why can't someone tell a purely archetypal story or have a purely archetypal movie? It's because the archetype always has to be enfleshed within a culture.
Right.
You can't think outside a culture. You can't live outside a culture. You can't speak outside of language. So you never will define Christianity outside of a culture, but yet somehow the thread is not lost. And that's a
remarkable thing.
When you think about that, it's just like wham.
Yeah.
It just blows your mind. And then and that's what's interesting about Peterson, because Peterson then tries to ground the Bible all the way down into biology, which is a fascinating move post Darwin.
Yes, absolutely.
And in a sense,
post Dawkins too.
Yes. What happens in the 19th and 20th century after Darwin is people begin to say, well, we can't trust the Bible. We don't need the Bible to know our origins. And in a sense, Peterson comes along and says, you can't have psychology without the Bible. It's like, what? You know, no. We exercised that book, and Peterson's saying, you're naive. You're naive.
We're done with it. And he's like, no, you're not. Yeah.
No, you're still living on its foundation. And the corpse that you've been feeding off continues to decay. And so if you really want to find the new wine and the new life, you have to go back to the foundation, which is, of course, a move that has been made again and again and again and again in church history. That was the Reformation. Almost every heretical movement does that. The Latter-day Saints did that. The Jehovah's Witnesses do that. So it's not a move without its risks. But what tends to happen with these these Christian heresies is that they go and they play themselves out, and the descendants, once the heresy is played out, the descendants are like, okay, I guess we got to go back to Christianity.
Yeah, but at least they have they're allowed within our Western social structures to pursue those heresies, which ultimately is, in the broader sense, part of the bigger game in the search for truth and meaning. So, and I think that's obviously part of the Western secular tradition in that sense that's made us who we are and that other cultures don't have. One of the things I noticed with the Quran, what I've read so far, that this is simplifying, but a quick overview of my perception was, okay, the interesting stories in it are taken from the Old Testament and the New. The originality is, I don't see how it's original. It seems very derivative. Yeah. It seems incredibly punitive. It's just really, like it just goes on and on about how, and the wicked will be punished, and those who follow God, and do, again and again and again. It doesn't even read like a good story. And it's interesting also how it stresses that God chooses whom he will to guide and to lead astray. It's many times it's said that, something like that, which to me suggests that not only is God kind of ambivalent about whether you go his way or another way, he kind of, he allows or even facilitates it somehow. And it's like, well, I don't know, maybe I'm getting that wrong. Obviously it's, that's the most likely answer, but as I said, it seems quite derivative from the biblical stories, but without much of an interest in storytelling, more just, you're going to be saved or damned, and you're going, basically it's so totalitarian as well. It's remarkable for that reason. I mean, people think that Christianity is, but you just have to look at this stuff to realize that they're not the same at all.
Yeah.
And I have my doubts about Muhammad myself. I mean, historically, I don't know, maybe he was having epileptic seizures, or perhaps he was a charlatan. I mean, he seemed to be peaceful enough when he was originally in Mecca, before they sort of gave him his marching orders, and then he went to Medina, and then he was like, that's it, I'm gathering up an army and I'm coming back and I'm going to show all of you. And he did. But it's like, that's your guy? That guy, the warlord? Him. He's your ideal guy. Okay. I don't like that. Sorry, but I think our guy's better, It's like, how is that an improvement? I don't see it. And I mean, it's one thing I understand, back to cultural things too. It's like, if you're brought up within that culture and that's your moral framework, of course, this is a thing I wonder about. That is someone who's been a good Muslim person to their family, to their community, what fate for them, if they're just doing the right thing as far as they know. It's like, it gets pretty tricky. And how do we negotiate that? It's not easy, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I've probably taken up enough of your time at the moment. We're running over time a bit here. I know you got to get your stuff together for your trip here, but I said in my email previously to you, my friend has got tickets for the thing you guys are doing at the end of the month, so we're pretty keen for that. It's going to be good, and would be great to meet you in person at that time.
Absolutely, I'm looking forward to it. Like I said, I mean, making the jump from the video link to a face-to-face conversation. I hope I'll have enough time to. Part of the frustration, I know the organizers, of course, want the event to be as big as possible. Me, I don't mind small, actually, because small, you get a chance to go deeper with individuals.
Yeah.
And so I actually feel a little sorry for Peterson in terms of what has happened to his life, because my sense is that he enjoys having conversations with individuals and learning from them. I mean, I think he would. I think.
Well, it makes sense for both of you to be that way. I mean, it's in your training and calling. I mean, he's a psychologist. He's used to dealing with people one-on-one. You're a pastor. You're used to small, tight-knit groups and a lot of one-on-one within that.
Yeah.
It's, and that would be massive change for him, and for you starting to get out there too. I can only imagine, Yeah.
Well, on one hand, it's nice because so many interesting people. On the other hand, I have limited time. We're all limited by time, and so it's. So I will. Well, I don't know how you feel. I mean, you've shared a fair amount of family stories in this. I don't know if this is something you'd be willing to post or not. If you want to think about it,
possibly, but I don't know if anyone would find it that interesting. I mean, it's not like your usual videos where you go hard hitting into more detailed theological or philosophical
I think
stuff.
people would
It's a bit
find
more
this conversation.
scattershot.
No, I think people would find this conversation interesting.
Okay.
I think people will find your story interesting because, and this is, I know this because I'm a pastor, because so you tell your story and your story is unique, and it is because of how your father was raised. But people, we get these, we see things on television and we think, oh no, normal is sane parents. No, it's everybody's parents are insane in their own way. And the insanity of your parents was unique, but everybody has insane parents. And so elements of those insanities people will pick up on. Your observations about China, some people will be very interested in that. And so part of what happens with kind of throwing it out on YouTube is it kind of gets picked over, but then certain people will grab onto elements and be very interested in it. And all of the diverse ideas that you had are kind of little Velcro hooks that someone will snag on. And then
I like that.
And then there'll be another interesting conversation. And actually what will probably happen if you because we're going to meet in, I've still got Melbourne.
Pretty good. Melbourne.
I'm trying to get but because we're going to meet there, other people will have seen you on this, and then they will come to the conference and they will say, oh, I saw you. And there'll be things that you said that they'll want to pick up on. And actually what I've learned from this strange thing that is YouTube, this actually can be a nice facilitation of we call it networking. That's so businessy, but of making new connections with people. And you don't know where those connections will go. So, there are obviously things that ought not to be shared publicly, but, I don't have the sense that you betrayed your parents at all in the stories that you told about them.
I would hope not. Yeah.
And
I mean, it's, you just try and appreciate them for all the good that was in them, and it's obvious they're good people, and you've got to be sympathetic to that, because we're all flawed and nothing's perfect. So I think they did the best that they could with their limited capacities to deal with stuff, and so,
which is true of all of us.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So I will, with your permission then, Ian, I will share this. It'll probably be later this week.
Okay.
And I'll kind of post it so that while I'm busy, YouTube will release it. And then hopefully what will happen is some people will see this, and I'm sure some people will make the connection then at the conference. And I think it's going to be fun.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, I trust you on this because you're the guy who does it and you know how it works. And, I just figured if you were interested in posting it, that's cool. But like I said, I thought my talk didn't go to plan in terms of like getting into the real nitty gritty of some of the points. But I had too many things to talk about anyway. I was like, what do I prioritize here? Anyway, it was really a pleasure to talk to you, and I really appreciate you giving your time like this. It's quite something, I think.
Well, the pleasure's all mine.
I really enjoy listening to your talks with people and your videos where you're dissecting things. I find there's a lot in that just, I don't know, it's inspiring to me, and I listen to it on my headphones when I'm walking around as a podcast or in the car. And it's really something, and it's great to see someone like you doing this, I think, and using YouTube for something like this rather than just something silly or aggressive or whatever. But yeah,
social media has gotten a bad name, and rightfully so. But this, I deeply appreciate the power of this to do good, and it just shows that if we use this for good, good can come of it. And we're deeply blessed to live in the time that we're.
Yeah. I think so. It's easy to lose sight of that.
Yeah. All right, Ian. I look forward to seeing you in Melbourne.
Likewise, it'll be my pleasure, and hope you enjoy your time in Australia. I think you'll like it. I hope so.
I think I will. Take care.
Okay, you too. Goodbye for now.
Bye-bye.